All right, thank you, everybody. This is the Gettysburg Assembly, but I just wanted to quickly update you guys. A week ago on Monday, a week ago yesterday, I spoke to you about a clock I was starting, 700,000 seconds. We will be reaching our 700,000th second at 10:30 this morning. Okay, just to give you an idea of how many people died during the Civil War. 1 second for every person that passed away during the Civil War. Starting Monday, last week, to 10:30 today will be the 700,000 second. Just think about that, to conceptualize that. With that, thank you for a wonderful week, for Civil War week. We're going to end it with the Gettysburg Address.
Good morning. Thank you all for allowing Mr. Knudsen and I to properly end Civil War week by sharing with you one of the most significant events that occurred 150 years ago to the day. And I think, as Mr. Furgueson said, very much an appropriate end to our Civil War week of commemoration. It's important for you to understand the sheer magnitude of death and destruction that occurred between July 1st and 4th of 1863 in a small town known as Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania. Approximately 1/3 of all 150,000 troops engaged were either killed, wounded, or missing after simply 3 days of intense fighting. This huge number of casualties is not much fewer than all U.S. soldiers killed in the Vietnam War over a course of 8 years. 3 days, 8 years. As General Lee retreated with his Confederate Army across the Potomac River back to the south, he was not pressed by the Union commander George Meade, and thus the war would continue for nearly another 2 years until Lee surrendered Appomattox in April of 1865. And there's some statistics behind my left shoulder. So as the two armies were both gone by mid-July, and the Union would be chasing the rebels all over the South the next 2 years in various parts of Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, the town of Gettysburg, with a population of 2,500 civilians, was burdened with nearly over 3,000 Union soldiers to bury in one makeshift town burial ground. That's when the governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, steps in. With the lower left here, on my lower left. Governor Curtin, who's actually in an election year, is pressed and hires a local attorney and businessman by the name of David Wills to commission a company to then bury the men, cleanse the burial ground, bury the bodies by state. Again, it's Union Army, Union soldiers who were buried. I believe at the time only 8 soldiers from the Confederate Army were left behind after Gettysburg. Buried by state, and they commissioned a company and paid them $1.59 per body to bury in this burial ground. Obviously, the makeshift burial ground was not large enough at the time, so the town of Gettysburg worked with the state of Pennsylvania. The state of Pennsylvania gave the town of Gettysburg 17 acres donated, as long as, with the understanding, it will be dedicated properly by a famous orator. Edward Everett was chosen just recently after the death of Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster during this time was kind of the most famous speaker and orator. People would not obviously go to movies because there was no technology. Your entertainment was to go hear speeches. Speeches would last 2 to 3 hours. Edward Everett would be the most famous speaker because Webster had just died. Everett's background, he's a famous Bostonian. He's a member of the clergy, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was governor of Massachusetts, and he was the president of Harvard College. He was invited to appear at Gettysburg on October the 23rd, but he said his speech would not be ready until November 19th because he had simply too much to research on the battle. Abraham Lincoln was invited simply as almost an afterthought, and he was put on the program to make a few remarks, and somewhat as an afterthought again, as Edward was the featured speaker for the day. So what happens that day? Lincoln actually arrived the night before on November 18th. He took a train, the train from Washington, D.C., which is a distance of about 85 miles. It took him 6 hours to get there by train because of the Confederate cavalry had ripped up a number of the tracks, and so there was a lot of damaged tracks that had to be replaced between that time. He went by himself without his family, and I'll explain that in a second. When he arrives that afternoon after the 6-hour train ride, he surveys the battlefield, and I quote, he talks about the traces of the fierce conflict, the rifle pits, the cut and scarred trees, the broken fences, the pieces of artillery wagons and harness, the scraps of blue and gray clothing, the bent canteens, the horse carcasses, and of course, still 2/3 of the bodies that were still left unburied. Coffins were stacked at the train station upon his arrival. He also arrives himself with a heavy heart. He had had some family tragedy. His son Willie had died the year before at age 11. His other son Tad was sick, Thomas is his former name, was sick and later died 7 years later. His only other son Robert at the time was not really around. He was a student at Harvard, and much to his father's dismay did not join the Union Army until much later in the conflict. His wife, Mary Todd, declines to come. She is in somewhat of a hysterical state because of the family tragedy, the illness, and decides not to attend at all. Edward Everett arrives at the battlefield on the day of in poor health at age 69, suffering from kidney trouble. A crowd of roughly 20,000 arrived to the burial grounds, and there was only one known photograph. You can Google it all you want. This is about the only one you'll ever find. A photograph taken by David Backrack. Because again of the shutter speed, again Mr. Bowerman could probably do a better job explaining than I can, the shutter speed did not allow for any type of photographs to be taken other than staged and posed photographs. So there's one. The famous Civil War photographer Matthew Brady was not present at the speech. So Everett goes on for nearly 3 hours. He makes his speech. He recounts it like a TV broadcast. He talks about the battle. He sits down, and now it's time for President Lincoln to make his remarks.
Someone said it's the greatest speech ever written. I've never found a reason to disagree. In the Gettysburg Address, President Lincoln explains, first, the purpose of the American Republic and why it was founded. Second, why it is essential to dedicate a national cemetery to those who died on the field of the bloodiest battle ever fought in this hemisphere. Third, why the North had to win the Civil War. And fourth, why an end to slavery had to be part of that victory. And here's what's so remarkable about it. He does all this in 273 words, and he never even mentions the words Gettysburg and slavery. Now, lest I be misunderstood, let me make one thing clear. I don't believe the United States is an exceptional nation, because I believe every nation is exceptional. Likewise, I don't believe that any one of you is exceptional, because I believe all of you are exceptional. As an individual, each of you is unique. Each of you represents a point in time when two lines intersect, never to intersect again. And so, I believe the same can be said of nations. Each and every nation that is and ever has been has had its own unique and special impact on the course of history, never to be duplicated again. And so it is with the United States of America. We are unique. Because we are a nation of diverse peoples bound not by ethnicity, but by a creed. A set of beliefs that Thomas Jefferson calls self-evident truths. These begin with a republic founded on the centricity of the individual. They include the idea that human freedom leads to human progress, that we should each be able to make the most of our time and talent during this life, and that every one of us has value, no matter what our roots or who our parents are. These are wonderful ideas. It's all too easy to take them for granted, forgetting how quickly they can be lost and how fragile they have been throughout history. Such ideas were never more fragile and in danger of being lost than during the Civil War. Think about it. If this nation, founded on this creed, had permanently split because of a bloody civil war only 87 years after its birth, the world might very well have judged the American experiment in popular government and the creed on which it was founded to be a dismal failure. And then the idea of a nation centered on the value of the individual might very well be abandoned, relegated to the trash bin of history, and lost forever. Lincoln understood all of that. He believed that if the Union Army was defeated, the experiment would come to an end and the loss would be an epic tragedy for humankind. And so when he came to Gettysburg that November of 1863, he was resolute in his conviction that the war had to end in Union victory, and that those who paid the ultimate price to secure that victory had to be honored. He also understood that the best way for us to live it, to honor them, would be to pick up where they left off, continuing the struggle to preserve a nation, quote, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Given where we are in our history today, I think Lincoln's words are every bit as relevant now as they were then. Indeed, they may be especially relevant now. And so again, the President articulated all of this in a 273-word address delivered in less than 3 minutes. It was midday, 150 years ago today, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on November 19th, 1863. Here's what he said. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.